Recently, I made a community post pointing out a pretty common trend in the martial arts community to bring up Mars, the Roman god of war, as the root of the word martial, therefore proving the link between martial arts and war and combat, or something to that extent. Before I jump into the meat and potatoes of this video, which is largely going to be about terminology, I want to review and clarify my view on the term martial arts itself. I've been very fortunate to be growing the channel, and I think some people might need to be brought up to speed. The Lightspeed summary here is that I view the term martial arts as deeply subjective. In the Japanese context, with which I am primarily concerned, martial arts have only a dubious connection with the battlefield at best. Likewise, today, many have a dubious connection with fighting itself. Historically, these appear to have been combat sports and methods for self-perfection long before the narrative that this stuff was all purely about fighting or winning unsanctioned bouts. My personal view is therefore to evaluate a martial art and individual martial artists based on their own goals. For example, if a martial art's main selling point is that it will get you fit and you're not getting any fitter, then that is a low-quality martial art. If the goal is to win boxing matches and you're not winning boxing matches, then that is a low-quality martial art. If it's to make beautiful fight choreography and it looks just awful, then that is, as you might have guessed at this point, a low-quality martial art. The goal of this channel up until now has been, broadly speaking, to point out that these kinds of terms are tricky. A lot of what popular culture holds to influence this kind of terminology is, frankly speaking, inaccurate. Beyond this, terms change. Take Aikido's flagship concept, Aiki. Today, we roughly think of it as blending of energy, but its first appearances in Japanese language convey an image of two swords locked in a struggle, pushing into one another, neither side making any progress. Obviously, these definitions are basically antithetical. One implies we should yield to pressure. The other describes a tied-up position in which both parties are expending a lot of effort. So which Aiki is true? The answer is both. Martial arts are rife with terms like this: ki, kime, zanshin, kokoro, and many, many more. Depending on which style is talking and when they're talking, these might have an extremely diverse set of definitions. The term martial arts, as I will illustrate in a moment, is much the same. For some in my audience, I understand this imprecision is frustrating, maybe even uncomfortable on some level. Many come to videos like mine with an idea of what martial arts should be, after all. Yet everyone has slightly different views, and like the term Aiki, we are left asking, which vision is representative of the truth? From where I sit, trying to impose some kind of quote-unquote objective analysis of what martial arts should be is ultimately a useless endeavor. It's swimming upstream. Even if there was such a thing as a perfect interpretation, and I don't believe that there is, you wouldn't succeed in unifying everyone under that banner. That's just not how social interactions work. My position on this channel has been that these terms have all these issues with them. So rather than hyper-fixating on the best combat sport or ahistorical notions of battlefield prowess, we need to allow people to define their own martial arts journey on their own terms. Now, the caveat here is that I would expect martial arts and individuals to be consistent at the very least. If an art says it's a fighting art and doesn't produce fighters, that is obviously an issue. But if a martial art says it's mostly aesthetic and produces beautiful choreography, I see no reason to condemn it. I would judge individuals much the same way, consistent with their own aims. In this sense, martial arts is an extremely customizable concept and, in my view, is much more useful to us this way than just allowing it to generate endless debates about combat efficacy. The issue many people have with this, of course, is the word martial. Many people advocate that if a style is to be purely aesthetic, for example, that it is only correct to remove the word martial from the equation. Is it, though? The rest of this video is going to deal with why this is probably a little silly, why people likely feel it isn't silly, and what might actually be done to rectify the issue, if one considers it's even an issue to begin with. Spoilers, I don't, but I'm still going to give you some terms that might be useful. Let's start with this whole Mars is the root of martial concept that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. I've seen posts using this rhetoric, I've seen articles using it, and I've seen other YouTubers using it. But is it a good position? I'd argue not really. First, let's dash through a little history. Granted, I'm not a Roman or Greek historian, but I'm at least a little acquainted with it through my studies. As far as I've been able to dig up, Mars was worshipped by gladiators, but the gladiators also worshipped plenty of other gods too. Beyond this, I haven't found evidence to suggest any kind of link between Mars and, say, wrestling, for example. Tracing this back to Greece, the Olympics, where combat sports were, of course, held, were devoted to Zeus, not Ares, the Greek predecessor to Mars. Keep in mind, the Greeks had other war gods too, like Athena, but she also doesn't really seem to come up here. Perhaps there are some links between these sporting traditions to war, but much like ancient China, these links would have been predominantly for mental toughness, group cohesion, and physical fitness of the troops, not about actually using them on the battlefield. In other words, the link between Mars and martial arts in these ancient times is tenuous at best. But even here we run into issues because calling these martial arts is almost certainly an anachronism. In his book, The Invention of Martial Arts, Popular Culture Between Asia and America, alongside other publications of his, Dr. Paul Bowman convincingly argues the term martial arts didn't even enter the English lexicon until the late 1960s and early 70s. On top of this, the term at the time only appears to have referred explicitly to East Asian martial arts. In fact, the evidence suggests it was a direct translation of the Japanese word bujutsu. Of course, translating bu as martial is indeed legitimate, but the character also has class and philosophical connotations too. Although the translation would certainly be a little clunky due to a misguided attempt to equate warrior behavior in Japan to European chivalry, the translation chivalric arts might have also been valid. The more interesting problem here, however, is that wrestling, boxing, and their peers were not called martial arts prior to this time period. Arguably, they weren't even referred to as such during this time period. Their retroactive designation as martial arts is a relatively modern development. This takes a lot of the wind out of the whole Mars is the root of martial arts, and these are therefore warlike type argument. I've mentioned at the start of this video that I made a community post about this, and several of you guys had equally good insights. One, pointing out that these kinds of semantic linguistic arguments are cyclical and don't really ever go anywhere, which is true. Another pointing out that battlefield logistics under this martial equals warlike paradigm needs to be considered as a martial art. Indeed, cooking and moving troops are both art forms and would have been far more useful martially than how to wrestle some guy in a field. I understand, however, how the average martial arts enthusiast might throw their hands up and be like, come on, man, you know what I'm talking about when I say martial art. I think it is worth understanding why we are so attached to this idea that martial arts must be about fighting in some sense. Dr. Bowman offers us yet another answer in his article, The Birth of British Self-Defense, 1604 to 1904. Here he points out that the concept of self-defense was first codified into law in 1604 in the English language. Later on, practices such as boxing and wrestling would fashion themselves parallel to this, now culturally centralizing idea. In other words, long before boxers were calling their practice a martial art, they were selling their practice as a valid self-defense method. This is important because it means what the West would later define as martial arts became inextricably linked with self-defense in a way Japan never really experienced, or at the very least, when it did experience it, it was for a comparatively much shorter time. Martial arts as self-defense really only lasted from the late Edo period up until the end of World War II, a paltry century and a half. I would argue that modern Budo largely is divorced from the idea of self-defense, partially because of the post-war political climate and partially because public physical violence in Japan even today is exceptionally rare. In the English-speaking West, however, this lineage has been more or less unbroken since 1604, 400 plus years of being concerned with self-defense, and about as much time linking martial practice to that concept. So long, in fact, that we seem to have culturally forgotten that this is the origin point of the trend. So, where does this all leave us then? If martial arts is such a nebulous term, both etymologically and historically, what should we even call what we are up to? Personally, I'm not entirely convinced that we need a category, but I understand the usefulness of having a shorthand. In fact, I think if we all just treated the term martial arts as a shorthand as opposed to an immutable description, a video like this probably wouldn't be necessary. Of course, like I said before, it's pretty unrealistic to expect everyone to get on board with one person's idea of how we should or ought to do things. Instead, I'll offer you the term that I've been starting to feel best encapsulates my own approach, and that term is physical culture. This terminology, as some of you might be aware, is not new. Actually, the physical culture movement in the mid-1800s to mid-1900s was an umbrella term used to indicate gymnastics, aerobics, weightlifting, calisthenics, and yes, what we would later call the martial arts of wrestling and boxing. Some of you might have misgivings about my using this. For one thing, physical culture is also a pretty ambiguous term. For another, it might feel strange to use a Western concept to describe my primarily Japanese martial practice. It might well be equally as clunky to use as a translation of Bujutsu to describe Western practices. To address the first issue here, I like physical culture because it wears its ambiguity on its sleeve in a way that martial arts just does not. Martial arts feels very specific to us, even if it isn't really when it comes under scrutiny. Meanwhile, physical culture, at least to my eye, could accommodate every goal within martial arts with ease, from fitness to sport to an intellectual challenge. In other words, physical culture, perhaps a bit ironically, isn't a culturally loaded term in the same way that martial arts is, and therefore somehow manages to be a little bit more honest and a little bit more holistic. On the second point, physical culture is, of course, not really my idea, not by a long shot. Like I said, the physical culture movement predates our Western idea of martial arts itself. Having said that, I'd argue it had a major role in their initial translation to the Western context from East Asia. Judo, for example, published materials either inspired by or even directly lifted from famous bodybuilder Eugene Sandow. Don't ask me how to reconcile this with Kano's own distaste for muscle building, but these publications were produced in his own lifetime. More to the point, though, Kano himself specifically uses the term physical culture in his 1932 Olympic speech. In that same speech, he even argues for judo's superiority against gymnastics, something firmly under the physical culture umbrella at the time. Kano, being the scholar that he was certainly aware of physical culture as a movement. Indeed, Japan itself had a physical culture institution modeled after Germany's. In my opinion, physical culture is probably a better translation of Budo than martial arts is of Bujutsu. Sure, it isn't a direct rendering, but if you've ever done any translation yourself before, you know that a direct translation often fails to capture necessary nuance. In any case, the goals of the physical culture movement, in its own words, were physical, intellectual, and spiritual enrichment. This is not all that different from the aims of Budo. Of course, the physical culture movement was a product of its time and therefore had a lot of weird ultra-nationalist ideas wrapped up in it. Obviously, I'm not really arguing to bring those back from history. Pride in one's nation is healthy so long as it doesn't degenerate into a superiority complex, but it really doesn't have much to do with personal enrichment as we are concerned with it here today. In short, I would suggest calling what we do physical culture because it encapsulates fitness, sport, and cognitive growth in a way that the term martial arts often fails to in popular culture. Of course, not everyone will agree with me, and honestly, that's fine. Like I said, I'm pretty at ease with the idea that all of this is very subjective. If I'm contesting anything, it's that conversation around terminology is ultimately not really that useful to us, and that dwelling on this kind of thing is sort of silly. Even my suggestion to call what we do physical culture isn't going to make you more fit or a better sportsman. Maybe it'll make you feel better on some kind of emotional level that you now have a term to better fit your vision for your practice, but at the end of the day, it's all semantic. Calling what we do martial arts or physical culture, or even something like dance, a term which is often applied by the community in a sort of derogatory way, doesn't make what we are up to any less difficult or less meaningful. Terms are just terms. Words are just words. They are definitely useful, but getting tangled up on them is kind of an exercise in futility, especially when at least 2/3 of our practice tends to be about physical action. So this is where I'm at with this. Like many of my commenters have suggested, this kind of topic usually is a bit of a nothing burger. I want to point this out mostly to establish that this kind of topic is kind of a nothing burger, but also to give you my insight into how I view my training personally. Sure, I like functionality, but as I age, I'm increasingly more interested in just being able to train intensely and move the way I want to. To me, the martial is becoming much less important than the art. I don't see this as a contradiction, though, and I don't think you need to either, because it is consistent with the janky, ambiguous, subjective nature of both the terms we use and our individual practice itself. If you want to keep on calling what you're up to martial arts, that's absolutely fine. I suspect most will, because that's sort of the consensus-approved shorthand. I think saying you're a physical culturist will probably understandably merit you having to qualify what you mean, and you probably sound a little pompous. I haven't quite gone that far yet. Again, this whole video was really less about trying to convince you to jump over to my camp or trying to criticize other ways of thinking, and more so to ask, does this stuff really matter in the long run of training? Probably not. You're free to call your practice whatever you like. What matters is whether or not you and your practice are internally consistent and are delivering on the goals that were set out to be achieved. If both those boxes are being checked, whether or not you call kickboxing or weaponized foot fetishism or purple people punting or something else doesn't really matter, knock yourself out. Likewise, if you're doing a martial art for fitness, or heaven forbid, just because you think it's kind of cool and you enjoy it, then you don't really need to justify any of that in the arena of fighting efficacy or self-defense readiness. These things are largely overrepresented online. The point here is, yes, there are ways to make value judgments about our practices, even though they are deeply subjective. You just have to engage with the practice and the individual being questioned on their own terms. Of course, there will always be people who push back on this, but I've grown to believe that my take is actually a pretty positive one. It isn't the denial that martial arts should be of high quality, it's the acceptance that you can do what we do for any number of equally legitimate reasons, and that evaluations of quality need to be done relative to those reasons. Everything else is a bell or a whistle. In a world that more times than not is indifferent to us, I think it's nice to be able to practice something that is so deeply customizable and deeply personal, while it still being something that can be appraised logically. Basically, take it or leave it, but this is where I'm at. My next video will be about how you can do history, perhaps a bit off theme for the channel, but it's really so you can do all the stuff I'm doing on your own if you want. If you're interested in the dialogue between East and West and how it relates to martial arts, because trust me, Kano knowing about the physical culture movement is just the tip of the iceberg, check out the video on screen now. Anyway, look forward to that future video, and I want to thank you all so much for listening. As always, there is no Tengu channel without you, and I will catch you all in the next one. Peace.